something new in this program?
Yes.
Oh, great. Now, the other question I'd really be interested in, did you unlearn something? Did you have some misinformation about autism which this program may have removed? Well, I'm really pleased, just a few of you say this, but great. I mean, that was actually my very strong motivation behind doing this. There are so many misconceptions and they need to be tackled. But of course, there are still many more questions than answers. I'm very happy, for any discussion. Just ask questions and I'll try my best.
What do you think about the Asperger's diagnosis in general? And do you think it's valid, and do you think it's something that needs to be improved upon?
So, should I just repeat the question, or have you all heard it? This is about the Asperger's diagnosis. Is it valid? What should I think about it? It's very interesting about the Asperger diagnosis. It was completely unknown before about 1991, and then it suddenly absolutely swept everybody up in great enthusiasm. It was the kind of diagnosis that you wanted your child to have if they were on the autism spectrum. This was something much better than autism. And in fact, there was much overdiagnosis going on, so that in the end, everybody was saying, well, actually, he has Asperger syndrome, so it has special cachet, maybe he's really a genius. And autistic was suddenly got a really rather bad image. So very recently, a committee called, from time to time gets together, always new committee, of course, to decide diagnostic criteria in the psychiatric disorders, decided that it was time to give this all a shake-up, because Asperger syndrome was always thought to be just a label for the sort of more able part of this whole spectrum, for the people who were actually quite intelligent, very often had mild forms of autism, although they might be mild because of an enormous amount of compensation, as in the case of Sarah Hendricks you saw. But it was always still the idea that, yeah, it's a form of autism, so why give it that different label? So it's interesting now to see whether we could do without it. I think there is some use in it. I think it's it does tell you something about a person that that gives you more information than just saying that they're autistic or they're on the autistic spectrum. So you might have noticed some of the discussion in this program was, are we all on the spectrum, actually? So that's one of the unresolved questions. So actually, I would need some help from you to get people, because it's not good for me to do that.
Yeah, fair enough. I saw him putting that up from earlier.
I'm interested in the comorbidity between the spectrum, the autistic spectrum, and psychosis, because I used to work as a therapeutic companion of a 19-year-old teenager with Asperger's, and it was very interesting. And the whole time I worked with him, it wasn't really clear if it was really Asperger's or it had to do something more with the psychosis, because there was a lot of restructuring and psychotic episodes, and I'm really interested in the possibilities with that.
Yeah, so you all heard that question. What's the difference between psychosis and Asperger's?
Not much the difference, but
do they
match in some point?
Yeah. So they can occur superimposed on each other, unfortunately. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there is something very interesting in this mentalizing ability, which I talked about, that people have used these tasks like these triangles moving around with patients who have schizophrenia, and they seem to be hyper-mentalizing, especially those with paranoid symptoms. So it seems that the same mechanism that allows us to attribute very quickly mental states to each other is sort of in overdrive in the case of autism, it's like under other functioning. So, well, it may be possible that, you know, there is, in some sense, a common denominator in the sort of neurophysiology, but that remains to be seen. I think that's all. These are really questions that we have absolutely no answer to. But it is on the cards. People are looking for potential connections.
What would you say is the distinction between mentalizing and empathy?
Very good question. Distinction between mentalizing and empathy. So empathy is a very deceptive term. We all think we know what it means in everyday language, but actually it's very complex. At one level, it means just being, as it were, infected by somebody else's feeling. You know, just you're surrounded by crying people, you feel like crying. You have infectious laughter. It's absolutely amazing how this works. Somebody laughs and you just laugh as well. This is a form of empathy which exists in autism. Not necessarily in every person with autism, but a lot. There are slightly more complex forms of empathy as well. And again, people with autism can have that when they learn about how they feel and how maybe another person feels. It's sort of a very conscious way of feeling empathy. Now, mentalizing really has to do with our intentions. It has to do with predicting what another person is going to do next, or explaining why somebody did something. So you could say the most complex form of empathy will always involve some mentalizing, and maybe this sort of complex empathy, which involves recognizing what another person is feeling, what the cause of the feeling is, how it is different from your own feeling, even you may be drawn into it, and how you perhaps have to cheer them up or console them. So in other words, to produce the opposite feeling to what they have. So that is a very complex form of empathy which involves mentalizing, and I think it may be the case that autistic people really don't manage that very well. But these very simple forms of contagion, of emotion contagion, that seem to be that seems to be found in autism.
Would you say that's the distinction also between autism and psychopathy then? Because they're both...
There's a very big distinction between psychopathy and autism. And it's quite clear that the psychopaths are incredibly good at mentalizing, and they really use it to manipulate other people. But at the same time, they are very, very callous, and they don't seem to be very much engaged in the emotions of others, or they seem to be not really responding in the same way that other people respond. And autistic people respond when they, for example, see the expression of fear in somebody's face.
Thank you for your talk and documentary. So it's very, very interesting, obviously. But I just have a small question. As this is, for example, the UCL Neuroscience Society, I think that we haven't heard of a few people here that might be interested in, I guess, some really technical aspects. So I was just wondering, for example, if there were any distinctions within like the actual neurons, or like anything kind of the physiology of the brain rather than behavior as well.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Absolutely right for the Neuroscience Society. You're absolutely right. When this documentary was made, I think one of my ideas behind the script was, don't show any scanners, don't show any brain images, because everybody's always looking for them, and it's sort of a way of making concrete something that we have really still no idea about. And it's just a sort of sales technique, I think, most of the time. So yes, you can take it for granted that we do believe we know that there are dedicated systems in the brain that underlie this intention attribution, and there are different systems that have to do with these different forms of infectious empathy. That's all there, but that's at the level of, you know, not neurons, but like millions of neurons. And it's extremely crude at the moment, the way that we sort of assess this. I think it would be marvelous if we knew more about the right level of description, not just sort of pointing at a region in the brain and saying vaguely, you know, here, this sort of frontal part, and it connects with the amygdala. Yes, and maybe the connections are weaker here, or, you know, it's all very, very crude and really rather speculative, so I didn't want to talk about that. But yes, there is active research in this, and it you know, I'm sort of hopeful that, you know, maybe some of you, who, if you're interested, will actually get down to the nitty-gritty and say, what are the mechanisms? That would be absolutely